Good evening. I am Chris Ragan. The way I came here tonight was very simple. I walked over from the Leacock building through the hallway. And as an effort to be carbon neutral on the way here, I held my breath. So what I'm going to talk about is what a transition to a low-carbon world looks like, how we get there, and in particular, what kind of policies are useful in getting there. So 5 nouns will be my focus. The first is order. This is a statue. I don't know if you can see it in the light, but that's a statue of Adam Smith on High Street in Edinburgh, where he's buried 100 yards away. Leading member of the Scottish Enlightenment, author of the Wealth of Nations, the father of modern economics. And his claim to fame, among other things, in terms of economics, is making us understand the role that prices, market prices, play in society. And his insight was that when ordinary people look at a very busy and almost chaotic-looking world, he actually saw order. He saw that market prices rise when goods become scarce, and that market prices fall when goods become plentiful, and that in response to those changes in prices, resources flowed, labor flowed, financial capital flowed. And while he saw order at a point in time, he fully admitted that order at a point in time does not give you certainty over time. And that gets us to the second noun, which is unpredictability. 100 years ago, 45% of Canadian workers worked on farms. In the subsequent 100 years, there's been massive technological improvements, massive reductions in costs, and now we have less than 2% of the Canadian workforce works on farms, and we produce far more output than we did 100 years ago. That was not predictable 100 years ago. It probably wasn't predictable, or the extent of it, 50 years ago. 50 years ago, it also wasn't predictable that you could hold in your hand an iPhone or a lesser Samsung product, but that you could hold in your hand an iPhone that would be 1,000 times more powerful than a computer that would have filled the room 50 years ago. And in addition to being a computer, it was a telephone, it is a telephone, and a camera, and a GPS, and almost everything else you can imagine. Not predictable 50 years ago. 30 years ago, nobody would have predicted that you'd have a major multinational corporation whose business model is about selling high-priced coffee and encouraging people to sit around and do all kinds of things while they drink high-priced coffee. Unimaginable 30 years ago. And even 10 years ago, people wouldn't have predicted that while you were sipping your latte at Starbucks, you could be calling up your Uber on your mobile app instead of paying high prices for taxis. So a lot of unpredictable things happen in market economies. And another part of unpredictability is about policy. So these are two faces of the great federal election and the great free trade debate in 1988, Brian Mulroney and John Turner. Now, the introduction of free trade in 1988-9, and then its expansion to NAFTA 5 years later, led to the prediction that resources would flow out of sectors where we couldn't do things very well and into sectors where we could do things very well by international standards. That much was easy to predict. But what you couldn't predict was that Canadian wine would actually be successful. 20 years ago, 25 years ago, people thought Canadian wine would get wiped off the face of the earth. They also thought that textiles, like men's suits, would get wiped off the face of the earth. But these two industries found their niche, and they are thriving in Canada. So that takes us to the next noun, which is, what does our transition look like? As we're trying to move from a high carbon or a carbon intensive world where we use coal and natural gas and oil of various kinds, conventional and unconventional, what does the transition look like to cleaner or less carbon intensive energy sources? The challenge here is that these energy sources are fabulous. Nobody should look down their nose at fossil fuels. They are fabulous. Tremendous concentration of energy in a very, very short volume or small volume, you ignite it, you get an explosion of energy. That's why this stuff gets used, and this has powered civilization for the past 150 years. But it's got a downside, and the downside is carbon emissions, and that matters. So how do we make a transition away from this to what we need? Well, that transition has to be about changing behavior, and it has to be about changing technology. And those two things are going to go hand in hand. And we're going to make a transition to these kinds of things: more nuclear power, more hydropower, more solar power, more wind power, more biofuels, and lots of other things that, whose pictures I couldn't find on Google. So then you think about how to actually make this transition. What are the policies that we need to make this transition? And here's where we get to the next noun, which is an important one, because it's very intuitive for most people that there are two easy ways to make this transition. One is that we introduce government regulation, and the other is that we subsidize the things that we think are good. And the problem is that these two things tend to be very expensive. They may actually achieve what you want, but they do it at a very high cost. There's all kinds of research that shows how regulation, direct prescriptive regulation of various kinds, is much more expensive than some market-based alternatives. And there's oodles of evidence that suggests that shoveling money into various projects can actually lead to those projects succeeding, but it can also be at a very, very high cost. Which brings you to the final noun, which is efficacy. What kinds of policy can actually achieve the transition that we want and do it in a cost-effective, i.e. low-cost way? And I would say, and I'm not being very creative here, I'm just an economist, after all, we're fairly simple people, that if we actually paid attention to prices, we could actually get what we need here. So a price on carbon across the economy, a price on carbon emissions will actually help you achieve what you want. You put a price on every time you emit carbon, whether it's from your tailpipe or your smokestack or your home chimney, you will create a powerful financial incentive to do less of those activities, and you will also create a powerful financial incentive to innovate, to create new lower carbon forms of energy and lower carbon forms of doing business. So if you want to achieve the transition in the best way possible, I think we need to be mindful of Adam Smith's message about prices and Bob Barker's message about getting the price right. So let me stop right there. Thank you very much.